Welcome to Pods with Posh and Paul, a podcast designed to inspire and challenge listeners through story, experience and insight. To face adversity, learn from suffering and discover how to embrace life with a heart filled with love and gratitude. We are so thrilled to have you journey with us and can't wait to share your stories. Join Sue O'Callaghan and Joanne Webb as we disrupt the theory that everyone has perfect lives. Losing a child is known to be one of the worst forms of suffering in life. The pain involved in losing 3 children at once is incomprehensible. But it is the tragic story of Jane and Martin Weeks, who lost their triplets in 2015, aged 2, in a fire in a shopping mall in Qatar. Their courage and bravery to endure such loss is remarkable, as they faced the shock and horror in a country that wasn't their home. In addition, as their world turned upside down, they had to endure national and international news reporters, social media, as well as the trauma of injustice and negligence. Remarkably, to this day, they have never received an apology. Join us on our podcast as Jane shares her day-by-day journey of survival, her courage to be vulnerable, a discussion on forgiveness, and her remarkable insight and wisdom that she shares with others who have suffered the loss of a child.
Good morning and welcome to this episode with Pods with Posh and Paul. How are you today, Jane?
Good, thank you. How are you guys?
Great, thanks. So Jane, you suffered one of the worst things any parent could ever suffer back in 2012. You didn't just lose one child, but you lost all 3 of your triplets in a fire. And we don't need you to relive all of that for us today, because what we really want for our listeners is to help them with coping mechanisms and strategies that they can put into their life. So how did you and your husband come together and work through such suffering?
I think initially because the 2 of us suffered really the same loss and nobody else suffered the loss of their children the way we did, that really actually drew both of us really close, particularly really intensively for a period of time after that happened. And there's a certain thing when somebody shares the same experience that you understand that they know it. And I think for parents who have lost children, there's quite a thing that if somebody hasn't lost a child, you can go into it quite early feeling like somebody else won't understand. And so Martin and I very much, I don't think we were apart for quite a number of weeks after it happened. And when he had to go out for some reason, or I did, I remember becoming really anxious about it, which is not something I've ever experienced before.
And your triplets died tragically in a shopping mall in Doha. So your story reminds me in many ways of the Madeleine McCann case, in the sense that you were overseas, you were in the media limelight, you had to face social media, plus the grief and loss. That's a huge burden on top of the loss to carry. How did you cope with the grief in the media and overseas without the support of your family around? That must have been such an additional loss.
That was really difficult, and I remember having to call my parents to tell them what had happened, and with the time difference, so Lily Jackson and Will had died in the morning in Qatar, where everyone was still asleep in New Zealand. And I remember really clock watching, and we called them at 5 o'clock in the morning New Zealand time to try and make sure they got not woken up in the middle of the night with it, but didn't risk waking up and seeing it on the news. We were really fortunate that we lived in a compound which is essentially like a group of townhouses in a gated community, and our neighbours were all really supportive and kind of pulled together really quickly. Plus we already had good friends there. We'd been there for 6 years when this happened, so we had a really good support network, including people who were really good at things involving the media. My husband has a marketing communications background amongst a whole bunch of other things, who actually helped take the management of that from us. So in some ways we were shielded from it, particularly from, I hate to call it this, the mainstream media, but social media was quite a different way to experience things, for sure.
I guess social media is harder to control, isn't it? But what you're saying is that you had a community around you, which was really important. And at that time, there's so many needs that people can step in and support in terms of the immediacy of situations. Was that really hard for your parents to be so far away at that time?
Yeah, it was really difficult for them, and particularly it's not just one flight from New Zealand to get to Doha. So, and even now when I look back, I my grasp on timelines of things is incredibly tenuous. What felt like it was actually a really long time was actually a matter of a couple of days. And so I know they actually flew out with a reporter from New Zealand who was on their flight, who was really respectful. But yeah, it was really hard for them being away, and it was hard for them to arrive, and it was hard for them to come back home. It was, it's just all different types of hard rather than varying levels of hard, I think.
There's no rule book for any of this, is there? And when we're faced with such suffering, and everybody goes into their own shock in a different way, I suppose, don't they? And everybody has a different way to deal with grief.
Yeah.
So I'm interested because Sue and I were talking earlier about how a lot of couples, when they lose a child, the statistics for them not being together is so high, not staying together. Whereas you and your husband, you've gone on, you've had twins and another baby, you're here together, you seem like a really strong unit, which is amazing. So how do you think you two have worked together to go down that line, whereas other people just fall apart?
And that's a really interesting thing that you say that, because I did a fair amount of research into that when I was doing my postgrad work last year. And statistically, people who've lost children are actually no more likely to break up than people who haven't. And a lot of it comes down, I think, to the quality of a relationship beforehand. It's like having kids. Having a baby doesn't make a tenuous relationship better, and losing kids won't necessarily bring you together from it. And I actually think it's a really dangerous thing to say, because when people say that, and I was told that after we lost the kids, that a lot of marriages don't last, this sort of thing, which is actually really not helpful to hear something like, you've just had this terrible thing happen to you, but wait, there's going to be more.
Yeah, and that's where we've got to be really careful, I suppose, of the media and statistics, because statistics just come from one area. They're not actually looking at a much bigger picture, I suppose, are they? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I tried to look for a range of things last year, because I was really interested in that statement that lots of people will break up, but in my experience and talking to quite a number of families who've lost children, is there's definitely a period of time when you become closer and you become quite insular in your grief, because you are the parents. It is just the two of you, or potentially there's blended families involved, but longer term, people do go back to what we call the default of their relationship. That things do tend to come back to normal, and the same things that were annoying beforehand at some point will potentially become annoying again, and that's sometimes no more or no less than in any other situation.
Yeah, I get that.
I'm quite interested in how our lives change when we suffer, and how we connect with other people because of it. Often they say that if you've not survived or been through death yourself, it's quite hard to understand other people and where they're coming from. You obviously have gone on to have more children and connect in playgroups and school environments. Do you find it quite hard in those situations in terms of the loss that you've had to cope with? Is it that when people say how many children have you got, there's always the question, isn't there? Do you say 6? Do you say 3 children? Because you don't want to leave 3 children out. Do you find people's reactions quite difficult because they haven't experienced grief themselves? How do you find it in social situations?
And actually, I don't have a hard and fast rule for what I say in that situation. Quite often, if I'll say I have 3 children at home, if I don't really want to elaborate on it, and if I'm in a situation where I know I'm meeting people who have either lost children or gone through something as well, I'll say 6, but 3 of them died in 2012. But it's a real conversation killer. Yeah. And it's not always, sometimes it just doesn't always feel safe to put it out there, and it's something you want to almost have a little bit of trust of someone before you share something that's so important.
I guess that's a really useful tip for our listeners who've lost a baby or carried a baby and lost while pregnant is are you safe? It's all about your safety, isn't it? Are you emotionally or psychologically safe in what you want to discuss with somebody?
And you don't have to say the same thing all the time. You don't have to have this is my blanket statement for when somebody asks. And, you know, even if you say, if you have one living child, or if I've got 3 living child, if I just say to somebody I've got 3, I'm not disrespecting or denying that Lily, Jackson and Will are an incredibly important part of my life. It's keeping them precious and keeping them for the right time to share them.
Yeah, and I suppose you've got to be psychologically strong whenever you do share that, because if you shared it in the wrong situation, then you're just putting your grief out there and open to more hurt and pain, aren't you?
Yeah, and sometimes it's really hard for a lot of people to hold that type of thing. There's one thing, you know, the natural order of grief, and we expect to lose our grandparents, and then we expect to lose our parents, and when you can share things like that quite openly, and you know, people have empathy and sympathy and kind of being able to continue through something. But then when you sometimes talk about the death of a child or a baby or more than one child, it can be really confronting for some people. And it's, you know, I don't always just want to make it really hard on the person that I'm talking to, and I try to be conscious of my own safety for when it's the right time to share, but also when it's the right time for them. So we're kind of meeting in the middle of it.
So Jane, for listeners who have recently lost a baby and are feeling they can't connect with their social group, the young mums that have still given birth their babies and they're carrying them in their arms, who can they contact? Where is a point of reference that they can go?
Definitely SANS. SANS works with people and supports people through pregnancy, baby or infant loss. They're an entirely voluntary run organisation, and they have volunteers all over the country who will come into the hospital and give support as things are happening. Some people are aware that their baby's going to die before the baby's born. And they can do all sorts of incredible things with memory making, so hand and feet prints and casting and photos. And then support groups afterwards, because I found particularly important after Lee Jackson and Will died is, and this is one of the marvels of social media, is looked for parents who hadn't just lost a child but had lost all of their children. Because to me that felt really quite different than, you know, you lose one child and then you've still got to take care of living children. And I really needed to see the physical proof that it was possible to live through it, because at the time it happened I honestly didn't believe it could. And so finding, you know, people who had experienced it and were living with it, and for all intents and purposes were still living lives in many ways, or that looked happy and normal, so to speak, was incredibly helpful. And people are great about reaching out in that situation,
because it is about survival, isn't it? No matter what situation we're facing. We've had on the podcast people that have lost 85% of their body, people that have faced cancer diagnosis, tragic circumstances. And what we found again and again is that you want to connect with people that have similar circumstances to you but have survived it, because you want to know you can survive. You want to find the hope. And if somebody else has also lost 3 children or lost 4 children, you think, well, look at them now and look what they're doing now. They have survived. This is what tools they use to get through. And we want to connect. So again, to our listeners, whatever situation you're facing right now, connect with people in like-minded situations that can give you the hope, because they're just a little step further ahead than you. It doesn't mean they've healed or recovered, but they're ahead of you on your journey.
Absolutely. It's the same way somebody who gets a really terrible diagnosis of some type of illness, and you desperately Google away looking for, you know, the stories of people overcoming it, and that it can be really inspiring, really helpful. So this is not dissimilar. And I think when something as big what happened to us, that those first initial period is that triage time. It's not the finer points of lots of counselling and becoming a great self-actualized person. It really is survival. It's, you know, it's getting food and water and shelter and the basics of life that actually keep you alive, so you then have the chance to sort of process things.
It's interesting because I had my 3 children, aged 1, 3 and 5, abducted when I was pregnant with my 4th child, and then I was told that my 4th child would be taken from me at birth and I wouldn't hold her. And at the time, all I did was connect on the internet who has been through child abduction and what do you do in that situation. And again, it is basic survival. I've just got to get through this day. Where do I turn to? And I know there'll be listeners in all sorts of situations that might not have lost children but are desperate to know how to survive. And it's great in many ways that we've got the internet, isn't it? Because it is a form of connection.
Yeah.
It's a lifeline for many people, I think.
It is. And it doesn't even have to be trying to survive a day. It can be literally trying to survive the next half hour or the next hour, and trying to just break things down into just tiny, manageable pieces, because the concept of sort of eternity feeling one particular way is so enormous and just so overwhelming.
Yes, I can remember people walking down the street carrying shopping bags, and I remember thinking, how can people be so free that they can just shop? They've got no worries in the world to be able to shop, and I don't know if my children are dead or alive, where they are. And time gets it so extended, doesn't it? We talked earlier about time in the sense that what might be an hour or a minute just gets shrunk down. It's just so frightening how time just sort of slips away. You don't know where you are. I remember watching the clock and the clock didn't move.
But grief is so engulfing, isn't it? And pain is so engulfing, and sometimes you don't actually know how you can survive that level of pain. Like, as humans, we can survive some amazing things, and you think, and if somebody told you that you could survive that before you went through it, you think, no, that would actually kill me. But when human survival is so enormous and so amazing, but you do have to, as you say, you have to go through that minute by minute sometimes, because if you think about the whole day ahead of you, like another, say if you need to be awake for 15 hours, that's a long time feeling that level of pain, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And the other thing is, 2012 is 8 years ago. Many people would think, time heals, and time does heal to some extent, but it's also a myth, isn't it? Because 8 years later, it's almost as raw as it was then. You have those moments where you're actually in it again and again and again. I'm fascinated that you've completed a postgrad diploma in health science in violence and trauma. What was your understanding of trauma in terms of grief? Did that change your perception of your own journey? What was the key takeaway from that course that you did?
Well, previous to that, I did a Bachelor's of Counselling degree, which was really useful in learning ways of helping other people, but it was a really great self-reflective process of the things that were available to me and the things that I did that led me to actually being able to even think about doing something like that. And the violence and trauma one was, I guess, also particularly interesting because a lot of it was dealing with things that were outside my frames of reference. And I think what that mostly taught me is probably some of the reason that Martin and I were in a position to have choices in what we were able to do when we were traumatized and grieving. We're very privileged that he was working. We were financially secure. We had a great support network. Neither of us have a background of drug and alcohol problems or abuse in our childhoods or poverty or anything like that. So for us, this very much, we kind of it had all that stuff as a parachute to make it easier for us. And when I think about people who have to go back to work within a month of losing a child or children, or if they're unwell, and they've got all these other worries on top of that, and it'd be really wonderful if trauma or grief, one incident could happen in a silo and that could be it, but it's not the way the world works. There can be also so many other problems that make dealing with that particular thing that much harder. And so actually coming out of that was probably the key thing for me personally, is recognizing where the privilege that I was fortunate to have, how that gave us an advantage of being where we are today.
To even think like that is an amazing way to be able to think, to be able to take yourself outside of it and look over your life like that. It's a very humbling thing to be able to do. But you're right, if people have kind of got that background of either alcoholism or drugs or abuse, then if they go through some kind of suffering, it's very easy to fall back on things, isn't it? Or to not be able to cope, to have extra things to deal with. I mean, it's a it's a tough life sometimes, isn't it?
And trauma is such an interesting topic, isn't it? Because I'm interested in your study on trauma, because I'm wondering how much it relates to shock. I've nursed both my parents dying over a period of time, and there was no trauma at the end of it. There was grief at the end of it, but no trauma, because there was time to get used to it. Yet in terms of child abduction or loss of children in a fire, when it happens in an instant and there's such shock, the trauma obviously in the grief process changes the grieving journey. Does it prolong it? I'm so interested in your study on trauma and the effect it has on our healing process.
I also wonder too about something like when you lose your parents. My mother died in 2016, and it was horrible and incredibly upsetting, but even still, again, there's the natural order of what you expect in life, and I think with child loss, it's so against the natural order of things. We're supposed to outlive our children, and with our children, we've already sort of projected a lifetime of hopes and dreams. Even before we've conceived them, quite often people have dreamed of their names and what they might look like, and all of this sort of stuff. And so when people lose a baby in pregnancy or shortly after birth, or even somebody who can't conceive, is not just grieving somebody they've met, they're actually grieving and traumatized by the loss of this entire future as well. And I think that's what makes child loss quite unique, is it's not just the loss of past and history, it's the loss of such a huge amount of your future.
And I think even when you hear of people who have lost children, and say the parents now in their 60s and the child's in their 30s, often that parent in their 60s just wants to die with them, because and it doesn't matter how old our children are, the grief is so big because we love them so unconditionally, and we've brought them into this world with such, as you say, with such hopes and dreams for them. So I think obviously losing a baby seems like it's incomprehensible to most people, but I think as a loving parent, I just don't think it gets any easier. I think you're right, because it's not the right order of things.
In addition as well, you suffered a grave injustice, and I think when injustice comes into it, where there was a wrongdoing, where you look and think the situation could have been changed if A, B and C had taken place, it'd be different. So listeners might have had a child murdered, and therefore when an injustice comes on to the death and the loss of the dreams as well, the grieving process is so much harder, isn't it? So much longer. What was the role that you and your husband played in terms of forgiveness? Where does forgiveness come into it? Is that a big topic for you?
It's a really interesting one, because you hear quite a lot, you've got to forgive to move on, and I don't think you do necessarily. There's a level of the people who are responsible for Lily Jackson and Will dying didn't suffer any repercussions other than their own feelings of guilt, I guess, and I would assume they've all got that. I wouldn't wish feeling like I'd been responsible for the death of 13 children and 4 teachers and 2 firefighters. Feeling like you'd had played a part in that. I wouldn't wish that type of feeling on anybody. And now when I think about that, I think I could forgive people for something like that, because it was negligent and due to ignorance and laziness, and rather than something fully intentional. But if they'd said something about it, for example, if the mall owners or the nursery manager and owner had said, I'm so incredibly sorry, we made such horrible mistakes, and I can't live with myself, but we'll make sure this never happens again, would go some way for me to having a certain amount of forgiveness. And I think that's probably my number one concern about a country like Qatar, is when people have been responsible for the cost of life and then don't acknowledge it for future people, it feels like there's risk, and that's unforgivable.
And I think that's really important for our listeners, no matter what circumstances they're going through, where they've really suffered, in terms of there's been an injustice or wrongdoing, whatever it might be in a relationship, abusive relationship, is it's so much easier to forgive or be released from the pain of the trauma or the tragedy when there's a sorry, when there's an understanding, what I did really hurt you, what I did was really wrong. It's easier to forgive, isn't it, from our point of view, because there's an understanding that we can cut the ties with, well, why couldn't they see it was wrong? Why couldn't they say sorry? Why couldn't they release me from my pain? I always think that's really interesting, forgiveness, in the sense where there is a comeback from the other side, and you're it's almost like you're freed from the pain that you're carrying to some extent by that acknowledgement.
And I understand it's really, really hard to forgive in them situations, because it's people of like a higher power, if you know what I mean. They seem kind of inhuman in a way, because there was no apology to you. And I can see maybe why that forgiveness is such a hard step to go through. How do you deal with it? Because some people would be really bitter, resentful about it, and it would carry them around, and then that would be a burden to them. And I think that's where forgiveness comes into, because you've got to release yourself of that resentment and bitterness, don't you? So how have you done that if you can't forgive?
I think a lot of it really just came with time. It was, harder initially, and particularly the court case dragged on for years. So we'd be sort of trying to create what happiness we could in and around it, and then we'd get dragged back to that day. And it was particularly difficult for my husband, because it was him really who dealt with all the legal things, and he did an incredible job of bringing all the other families of the children and the children and the teachers together, kind of as a relatively cohesive unit of people from all around the world, to try and stand up to this, which was, it was a useful thing for him, for his dealing with his trauma, because he's a doer, and that gave him some control over something that he could do in such an uncontrollable situation. And I wish I had some great advice for people who can't forgive, and somebody who's been intentionally hurt, or had somebody close to them intentionally hurt, and that's not my experience, so it's hard for me to imagine what that would be like. But I think it comes down to how much is it impacting you and your life. And you don't have to forgive, you just have to learn ways of living with your feelings of anger and resentment in a way that, because you being angry at somebody from 1,000 miles away isn't going to impact that person. It's going to eat you up. But so it's really hard to hold it. You don't have to forgive, but how can you live with those feelings in a way that means your life is still as okay as it can be?
And anger does have its place, doesn't it? Jo and I talk a lot about pain and suffering, and looking at the stories of the guests that come on board Pods with Posh and Paul. And anger is a very natural emotion to feel, and on that grieving journey. So again, if you're listening and feeling really angry, that's okay. That needs to be expressed.
But it's looking at what's underlying of the anger, because anger is always a second emotion, isn't it? So something has brought on the anger, whether that's immense pain or, as we say, resentment, bitterness. But that anger and rage is often brought on by something else. And I think then for your self-healing, you've got to then go back and look at what is the cause of the anger, and you've to work through that for you, not for the person 1,000 miles away or down the road who's done the wrong. It's for you, isn't it? And if you can't forgive, try to let some of it go for your peace of mind.
And anger's really motivating. Sadness can be quite debilitating, but anger is one of the things that can get you out of bed in the morning. Anger is the one that can get you to walk into the courtroom and fight great injustice. So, I've met a number of people who've lost children in terrible circumstances, and they've gone on to do incredible things. Like create organisations like SANS who step in where there's nothing available through government channels. It's pretty incredible that it's volunteers that have to go into our hospitals to do these sorts of things for people at times where their baby's dying or their baby has died. But that's that sense of injustice, and it's anger, I think, that motivates people to do that.
Anger is the passion behind a driving force which enables somebody to create change. And obviously you're doing that in the work that you're doing with so many people, and you're an inspiration. Even by just telling your story, you'll be inspiring so many people. Jane, you've taught us so many lessons today. You've brought so much insight, and obviously from your own experience of tragedy and suffering. For those that are going through something severe right now and in the midst of pain, and Joe and I talk about this a lot, is that our journey, we can look back on our journey and see the lessons we've learned, or we can see how we've learned resilience, or how we've healed. But when you're in it at the moment, it's bleak, it's black, it's shock, there's pain. What would you say to listeners who are in a place right now of severe trauma and they don't know how to get through it?
I think actually for me the message would be not necessarily for the person who's experiencing trauma, it's the people in and around them. There's a lot of pressure on us to do our own self-healing and our own coping, and a lot of focus now about self-care, which is quite the catchphrase at the moment. And actually I think community care and support, village care and support is probably one of the most useful things there are. It's for us as people to identify people who are suffering and do what we can, and even if it is the basics of life, do you need to drive their kids to school while they have a break? Do you need to take them meals? That sort of thing I think is really, really important, that we don't put all of the responsibility on the person going through a trauma. But for people who are, whatever they're feeling is normal. The whole range of emotions, the whole range of despair. You don't have to rush it. And hope is a wonderful thing, to be able to sort of catch little snippets of it. But if you don't have hope in the first few days, it doesn't mean there isn't going to be a tiny seed of that a little bit later on. And, just do what you can to get through minutes and hours. And think some things are just horrible. We don't have to feel like we're going to come out of something as a better person. Not everybody is going to create an amazing organisation like SANS afterwards, or do a counselling degree, or if you can just even fathom at some point sort of getting back to a semblance of what your life was before, that's enough. We can't push all sorts of unrealistic expectations on ourselves. Everyone can do what is right for them, and success for one person can look very different for success for somebody else, and it's entirely personal. There's no rating system of it, and it's what's important to the individual, really. Focus on your values.
I love that, because you're right. When you do see people that have been through things and they do go on to achieve great stuff, or they fight because of their anger, but then there's the other person who doesn't speak out about their great loss, but they're still surviving, they're still getting up every morning, they clean their house, they brush their teeth, they go, they should do the shopping. Well, they're doing just as much of a good job, and it's not about comparison, is it?
Absolutely. If you do what, living the life that feels important and sort of true to yourself to live, that's what success looks like. And don't be expected to get over something. That's just, it's like saying there's a timeline on how long you love somebody. That's not how the world works. And we're always going to regret that something has happened, and we're always going to miss people, and we're always going to love them, and there'll be days where that's closer to the surface than others, and that's okay. You don't have to feel that you're failing at grief or recovery or whatever it is, because you don't feel that you're over it.
No. And Sue and I were having a chat earlier, because we've both been through various amounts of suffering in our life, and I laugh now because sometimes I can't believe some of the things that we've been through, but some days it can feel like you're right back there, can't it? Like, it doesn't matter. I mean, and they say time is a great healer, but I think what that means is you just don't feel it to the intensity every single moment of every single day over time. But then occasionally something can happen, and boom, you're right back there, aren't you? And you think, where the heck did that just come from?
Yeah, it's definitely like that. And I think some things like anniversaries and things like that can be really hard, but also just any normal day. And I find music, that the songs that were played at the kids' funeral and things like that are really triggering. And I come from a relatively stoic family. We've got that. I mean, you guys would know that, coming from the UK, that you get on, and it's a stiff upper lip thing. And I've really had to learn over the last few years that if I'm sad and upset about it, it's okay to be sad and upset about it. And it takes a lot of energy to suppress that all stuff. So if you can honour the feelings and if you have to cry in the supermarket over the fruit department because that is where they play those sad songs, I don't know how they always time it for that, but
They do. I cried in every aisle of the supermarket. Like every single goddamn aisle. I went, are you kidding me?
Yeah, there's something that we've got to talk to the people who program the music in the supermarket, but it's it's almost like the pressure valve, that the pain is always there, and sometimes it's better to let it out than it is to just keep pretending that it's not there.
And at those times, just to be really kind to yourself, be really gentle to yourself, and know that you need a bit of extra nurturing to have that time to nurture yourself. I think for listeners, your message also about community is so important. And for those people listening thinking, gosh, well, I haven't been through anything as tragic as Jane, but I'm watching friends around me suffer right now. I'm not quite sure what to do because I can't relate to their suffering. That the message in there is so powerful that, I mean, I certainly remember at my greatest time of tragedy, I remember instantly, to this day, clearly, the people that knocked on the door, that put some food on the doorstep, that gave me a lift to a court case. I look back now and I think they were there holding me. They couldn't relate to my story, but they were there. And so the message is, be there, be that community, hold. Just be alongside. You don't need to rescue we're not looking to be rescued, are we, when we're suffering, but we're looking for somebody just to hold or stand alongside us, to say, I am there, I can do what it takes, and I will stand alongside you.
Because you can't take away somebody's pain.
No.
You can't, I mean, unless you're an anaesthetist, but it's, and if we can all go into how we're trying to help people or support people or even just be a good friend or parent or cousin or auntie or uncle, is... we don't have to try and make somebody feel better, but we can help give them the space to sort of come to that on their own.
Be the village. Jane Weeks, thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your wisdom and insight and inspiring us all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for being with us today. For us to inspire others to live their magnificently imperfect life, please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or on your podcast app. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Pods with Posh and Paul. We can't wait for you to join us on our next episode. Love, light and peace.